new Maritime Incident File has surfaced. If you appreciate these types of mermaid stories, take a short break to like and subscribe. Either way, enjoy.
In September of 1979, a waterman named Cecile Broom reached into the gray water of the Chesapeake Bay to clear a fouled crab pot line, and something reached back. What happened in the next 60 seconds would end a career that stretched back 3 generations, silence a man for 4 decades, and leave behind only a journal that his widow would not find until after his death in 2019. The hand that closed around Cecile Broom's wrist that morning did not belong to any creature catalogued in the long memory of Tangier Island, and the face that rose from the fog-covered water pale as drowned flesh, framed by dark hair that moved like kelp in a current, watching him with eyes that held no white and no iris, only depthless black, would follow him into his grave. He never spoke of it to his wife, never told his sons, never breathed a word to the men he had worked beside since boyhood. He simply quit the water, claimed his back had given out, and spent the next 40 years carrying a truth so heavy it bent his entire life around its weight. This is what he wrote in the journal he hid at the bottom of his desk drawer, what he could never speak aloud, and what his widow Ruth finally read 3 weeks after she buried the man she had loved for half a century without ever knowing what had broken him. But to understand what Cecile Broom encountered in that fog, we need to go back to the island where he was born, the water that shaped him, and the morning when everything he believed about the bay and about God's creation was shattered beyond repair. Tangier Island sits in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay like something the modern world forgot to collect. A sliver of land, barely 3 miles long and less than a mile wide, rising only a few feet above the water that surrounds it on all sides. In 1979, the island was home to fewer than 700 souls, nearly all of them connected by blood or marriage to families who had worked these waters since the early 1700s, speaking a dialect that linguists claimed preserved traces of Elizabethan English, living lives that had changed little in 2 centuries. There were no bridges to Tangier Island, no roads connecting it to the mainland, only the ferry that came twice a day, and the workboats that carried watermen out to their crab pots and oyster beds in the vast gray expanse of the Chesapeake. The Brooms had been watermen for as long as anyone on the island could remember, their names scratched into church records and property deeds going back to the Revolutionary War, each generation teaching the next how to read the water, how to find the crabs, how to survive on the bay that gave them everything and asked for everything in return. Cecile Broom was 34 years old in September of 1979, with a wife named Ruth, who had grown up 3 houses down from his own, 2 sons under the age of 6, named after biblical patriarchs, and a 28-foot dead-dries workboat that his father had built with his own hands in the year before Pearl Harbor. The boat was called the Ruth Ann, named for his mother who had died when Cecile was 12, and he had worked it alone since his younger brother David had moved to the mainland 3 years earlier to take a job at the Newport News shipyard, leaving Cecile as the last Broom still pulling his living from the Chesapeake. Cecile was known on Tangier as a quiet man, the kind who listened more than he spoke, who showed up early to help a neighbor and left before anyone could thank him, who sat in the same pew at the Methodist church every Sunday with his wife and sons, and sang the hymns in a voice that never called attention to itself. He was deeply religious in the way of the island, not showy about his faith, not given to public testimonies or loud proclamations, but certain of God's presence the way he was certain. The sun would rise and the tides would turn, and the crabs would run when the water warmed each spring. Cecile Broom had read his Bible every day of his adult life, had memorized passages that brought him comfort in hard times and guidance when decisions had to be made, had built his understanding of the world on the foundation of Scripture and the accumulated wisdom of Ruth, generations of Brooms who had lived and died on this water. He trusted the Chesapeake the way he trusted the Lord completely, without reservation, without doubt, the way a child trusts a parent who has never given cause for fear. That trust would not survive the morning of September 14th, 1979. The fog that settled over the Chesapeake in the pre-dawn hours of that Friday morning was the kind that only the bay produces. Not the rolling banks that come off the Atlantic and break apart in sunlight, but a stillness that rises from the water itself when the conditions align just so. Temperature and humidity and atmospheric pressure combining to erase the world and leave nothing but gray. Cecil woke at 4 o'clock, as he did every morning during crab season, dressed in the dark so as not to wake Ruth, and walked down to his dock through air so thick with moisture that he could feel it settling on his skin, like a second layer of clothing. The Ruth Ann materialized from the fog as he approached, her white hull gone gray, her running lights barely visible from 10 feet away, and Cecil paused for a moment at the head of the dock, looking out at the wall of nothing where the bay should have been. Most watermen would have waited for the fog to lift, would have gone back to bed for an hour or two, and let the sun burn off the worst of it before heading out. But Cecile Broom had never missed a day on the water in 17 years of working his own boat, and he was not going to start now. He could run his potline blind if he had to, every float memorized, every marker known by feel and instinct. The geography of his territory mapped in his mind as clearly as the streets of the island where he had been born. He started the engine, let it warm for the prescribed 5 minutes while he checked his gear and coiled his lines, then cast off and motored out into the fog at dead slow speed, navigating by engine sound and the feel of the current against his hull. The world closed around him within seconds, the island disappearing into gray, the water and the sky becoming indistinguishable, everything reduced to the deck of his boat and a sphere of visibility that extended perhaps 20 feet in any direction. Cecil had worked in fog before, many times, but something about this morning felt different in a way he could not have articulated, a quality to the silence that seemed deeper than absence of sound, a weight to the gray that pressed against him from all directions. He reached his first pot at 0512 by the clock mounted in his wheelhouse, working by feel, hauling the trap over the gunwale and sorting the catch with hands that had done this, worked 10,000 times, and could do it 10,000 more without conscious thought. The crabs were good 6 keepers in the first pot, their blue-gray shells clicking as he transferred them to the bushel basket, their claws waving in protest at being pulled from the only world they knew. Cecil reset the pot, motored to the next float, repeated the process, and fell into the rhythm that had structured his days for nearly 2 decades. By 0600, he had cleared 12 pots and filled 1 basket, a solid start to the day, and the fog had not lifted even slightly, the gray pressing in as thick and close as it had been when he left the dock. He was working the eastern edge of his territory now, approaching the area around the old sunken barge that had gone down in a storm sometime in the 30s, its rusted bones resting in 15 feet of water and serving as an artificial reef where crabs gathered, numbers that made the risk of fouled lines worthwhile. Cecil had 3 pots set around the wreck, and he edged toward where he knew the first float should be, throttling back until his engine barely turned over, peering into the fog for the familiar orange buoy. That was when he noticed the silence. It came over him gradually, a realization that crept in rather than arrived. But once he was aware of it, he could not unhear it, or rather, could not unhear the absence of what should have been there. The gulls were gone, those ever-present voices of the bay that followed every workboat and announced every dawn, their cries as fundamental to the Chesapeake as the water itself. The distant hum of other engines, the sound of the fleet spread across the bay each morning, had vanished as completely as if Cecil were the only boat on the water. Most unsettling of all, the point-no-point light, whose mournful horn should have been sounding every 30 seconds to warn vessels away from the shoals to the south, had gone silent. Cecil stood at his wheel, listening to nothing, feeling the Ruth Ann rock gently in water that had gone flat calm, and for the first time in his life, he felt afraid of the Chesapeake. It was not a sensation he had words for, not a fear of drowning or collision, or any of the tangible dangers that watermen lived with every day, but something deeper and more primal, a sense that the rules had changed, that he had drifted into a version of the bay where the familiar no longer applied. He thought about turning back, about motoring home and waiting for the fog to lift. But even as the thought formed, he dismissed it with the stubbornness that had kept brooms on this water for 300 years. It was just fog, thick fog, and he had worked in worse. The orange buoy emerged from the gray like a small miracle, and Cecil let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief flooding through him at this evidence that the world still existed, that his pot line was where it should be, that whatever strangeness had settled over the morning was just in his head. He eased the Ruth Ann alongside the float, reached over with his gaff to hook the line, and began feeding it into the pot hauler, the familiar machinery taking over while his mind tried to shake off the dread that had settled into his bones. The line came up heavier than it should have been for a single pot, heavier than any reasonable catch could explain, and Cecil frowned as the winch groaned against resistance it shouldn't have encountered. He thought for a moment that the pot had snagged on the barge, tangled itself in the rusted wreckage below, but the line was still coming up, whatever weight was on it rising toward the surface rather than pulling him down. That was when he saw the shape in the water. Pale and indistinct through the murk, something was tangled in his line below the surface, something large enough to account for the weight, something that looked, in the dim gray light filtering through the fog, like a human body. Cecil's stomach dropped, and his hands moved automatically to stop the hauler. His mind already racing through the grim practicalities. He would have to call the Coast Guard on the VHF, would have to wait with the body, would have to give a statement and answer questions, and explain how he had come to find a drowning victim tangled in his crab pot line. He leaned over the gunwale, reaching into the water to feel for the line, to assess how badly the body was tangled, and whether he could free it without bringing the poor soul aboard. The water was cold in a way that shocked him. Cold far beyond what September in the Chesapeake should have been. Cold enough to make him gasp and nearly pull back before his fingers found the rope. He followed the line down through the murky water, his arm submerged to the elbow, and his fingers brushed against something that was not rope, not crab pot mesh, not the bloated flesh of a drowning victim. It was skin, smooth and cool and unmistakably alive. And before Cecil could process what his fingers were telling him, before his mind could catch up to the sensation, something closed around his wrist. The grip was firm but not painful, fingers wrapping around the joint with a pressure that suggested enormous strength held carefully in check, the way a man might hold a frightened bird to keep it from escaping without crushing its fragile bones. Cecil did not scream, did not cry out, did not make any sound at all later. In the journal, he would write that his voice had been stolen from him, that the silence of the fog had reached down his throat and taken the scream before it could form. He looked down into the water, into the gray-green murk that should have revealed nothing at this depth, and the water looked back. The face that rose toward the surface was pale as something that had never known sunlight, the white of deep-sea creatures, of things that lived in darkness and had no need for pigment. It emerged from the murk slowly, deliberately, as if the creature wanted him to see it clearly, wanted there to be no doubt about what was happening. The features were almost human, a woman's face, high cheekbones, a nose, a mouth, a chin, but the proportions were wrong in ways that made Cecil's mind rebel. Too long, too angular, as if someone had taken a human template and stretched it towards something else entirely. The hair spread across the surface of the water as the face rose, dark strands fanning out like kelp in a slow current, framing features that should not have been possible. And the eyes, God help him. The eyes held no white, no iris, no pupil, nothing but depthless black that seemed to drink in the gray morning light and give nothing back. That reflected the fog like oil on water, that looked at him with an attention so focused it felt like physical weight. Cecile Broom stood frozen, his arm in the water up to the elbow, his wrist held in that cold grip staring into a face that could not exist. It violated everything he knew about God's creation and the natural order of the world. He could see the rest of it now, or some of it, the shape beneath the surface that his mind had mistaken for a body, and he understood that what held him was not human, and never had been. The shoulders were too narrow, sloping down into arms that bent at angles human arms could not achieve, ending in the webbed fingers that gripped his wrist. Below that, where legs should have been, the body elongated into something else, something scaled and sinuous that disappeared into the murk, a tail that must have been 6 feet long or more, ending in fins that were ragged at the edges, torn or worn, ancient-looking. The creature did not attack. It did not bare its teeth, did not try to pull him into the water, did not do any of the things that Cecile's racing mind expected from something that looked like a predator, that had teeth he could now see through slightly parted lips, multiple rows of them, needle-thin and angled backward, designed to grip and never let go. It simply held his wrist and looked at him, and in its black eyes Cecile saw something that terrified him more profoundly than any violence could have. He saw curiosity. The creature was studying him. Cecile would later write that the worst part was not the fear, not the shock, not the violation of everything he believed about the world, but the recognition that he was in the presence of a thinking being, something with a mind behind those terrible eyes, something that was looking at him the way he might look at a specimen in a jar, trying to understand what it was. Time became unreliable in that moment. Cecile never knew if he stood there for seconds or minutes or longer, held in that grip while the creature examined him with patient, alien attention, the fog pressing in around them like a cocoon, the silence absolute, the world reduced to a man and a monster, and the cold water between them. The creature's free hand rose from the water, webbed fingers spreading, claws visible at the tips, not the claws of an animal, but something more refined, more purposeful, like tools designed for grasping and manipulating. It reached toward his arm, the arm that was still submerged, and Cecile felt those fingers touch his skin above the wrist. The touch was exploratory, not aggressive. The creature traced along his forearm, feeling the texture of his skin, the coarse hair, the shape of the muscle and bone beneath the flesh. It pressed gently at his wrist, where the pulse beat against its grip, and Cecile had the horrifying sense that it was counting his heartbeats, measuring him, taking data. The fingers moved up his arm to where the fabric of his work shirt met bare skin, and the creature paused there, rubbing the material between its webbed fingers, tilting its head as if puzzled by the concept of clothing. Cecile watched those ancient eyes examine him with the intensity of a scientist studying a new species, and somewhere in the frozen depths of his terror, he felt something he would never be able to explain to anyone, not even himself. He felt seen. Not threatened, not hunted, not prey, but seen, recognized as something worth understanding, worth the creature's time and attention in a way that suggested he was as strange to it as it was to him. The black eyes never left his face, watching his reaction to every touch, and Cecile understood with terrible clarity that he was being examined the way he might examine an unfamiliar fish pulled up in his nets, with curiosity and detachment and a desire to understand what he was looking at. The mouth opened wider, revealing more of those needle teeth, and the creature made a sound. It was not a screech or a growl or any of the animal's sounds Cecile might have expected from something that looked like a predator. It was clicking, rhythmic clicking from deep in the throat, a pattern of sounds that rose and fell and repeated with variations, almost like speech. The clicking resolved into something more complex, layered sounds that overlapped and intertwined, and Cecile felt something shift in his understanding, a sense that what he was hearing was not random noise but communication, that the creature was speaking to him in a language he could not begin to comprehend. He tried to speak himself, tried to form words, "What are you?" or "Please let me go," or some prayer to the God he had trusted his whole life, but his throat refused to cooperate, his voice stolen by shock and terror and something else, something that might have been awe. The creature tilted its head, a gesture so human it was almost more disturbing than its alien features, as if it was puzzled by his silence, as if it had expected him to respond. The clicking came again, different this time, a questioning tone that Cecil recognized despite understanding nothing of the language, and he realized that the creature was waiting for an answer. "What are you?" he thought, or perhaps said, the words finally escaping as a whisper. The black eyes blinked, lids closing from the sides, not top and bottom, another wrongness to add to all the others. And the creature made a sound that was almost soft, almost gentle, almost like recognition. Its grip on his wrist loosened, and the creature's hand moved to his palm, pressing against it, and Cecil understood with a jolt of something beyond fear that it was comparing their hands, its webbed, clawed fingers against his blunt human ones, measuring the differences, cataloging the similarities. For one impossible moment, standing in the fog on a boat his father had built, holding hands with something that could not exist, Cecile Broom felt the membrane between their worlds grow thin enough to see through. Then the creature released him. Cecil jerked his arm back so hard he nearly fell, stumbling away from the gunwale, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath coming in gasps that fogged in the cold air. He caught himself on the pothauler and stood there shaking, staring at the water where the creature had been, watching the dark hair fan out across the surface for one more moment before the pale shape sank back into the murk, the sinuous tail visible for just an instant before it disappeared entirely. The water closed over the place where it had been as if nothing had disturbed it. The fog swirled, gray and featureless, giving no sign that anything had happened. Cecil stood alone on the deck of the Ruth Ann, his right arm dripping bay water, the marks of cold fingers still visible on his wrist, and waited for the world to start making sense again. It didn't. Somewhere in the distance, muffled by fog that suddenly seemed ordinary again, the point-no-point light resumed its mournful horn, counting out 30-second intervals as it had every day of Cecil's life. Gulls cried, their voices filtering through the gray, announcing their presence to any boat that might have scraps to offer. The sounds of the bay returned, flooding back into the silence that had held him, and Cecile Broom understood that whatever had happened was over, that the creature was gone, that he was alone on the water, in the fog with nothing but his boat and his fear and a memory that would never leave him. He did not pull his remaining pots that morning. He did not radio the Coast Guard, did not tell anyone what he had seen, did not do anything except start his engine and motor home at full throttle, not looking at the water, not looking behind him, keeping his eyes fixed on the compass and the throttle, and the gray nothing ahead until the familiar shape of Tangier Island emerged from the fog like salvation. He tied up the Ruth Ann with hands that shook so badly he had to attempt each knot 3 times, and he walked home through the narrow streets of the island without seeing the neighbors who called out greetings, without hearing the children playing in the yards, without registering anything except the need to be inside, to be away from the water, to be somewhere the creature could not reach. Ruth was in the kitchen when he came through the door, feeding the boys their breakfast, looking up with surprise at her husband home before noon, with not a single bushel of crabs to show for his morning. Cecil stood in the doorway, looking at his wife and his sons, at the yellow curtains Ruth had sewn, and the wooden table his father had built, and the calendar on the wall, showing a fishing boat on calm blue water, and he tried to find words for what had happened. There were no words. He sat down at the kitchen table and watched his boys eat their eggs, and he said nothing about the hand that had closed around his wrist, nothing about the face in the water, nothing about the black eyes that had studied him with intelligence as alien as the stars. That night, after Ruth had gone to bed, Cecil sat at the same table with a journal he had bought years ago for recording his daily catch and never used, and he wrote everything down. He wrote for 3 hours, filling page after page with handwriting that started neat and careful and grew increasingly ragged as the memory poured out of him, words and sentences and paragraphs tumbling across the paper in an attempt to capture something that language was never designed to hold. He described the fog and the silence and the weight that had settled over the bay. He described the moment when he reached into the water and something reached back. He described the face that rose from the murk, the black eyes that studied him, the clicking sounds that might have been speech, the way the creature had touched his arm as if trying to understand what he was made of. On the last page, after he had emptied himself of everything else, Cecile wrote a single line that would not be read by another human being for 40 years. I don't think she meant me harm. I think she wanted to know what I was. God help me. I wanted to know the same about her. Then he closed the journal, hid it in the bottom drawer of his desk beneath old tax documents and receipts from marine supply stores, and never opened it again. The next morning, Cecile Broom told his wife that his back had given out. He said the years of hauling pots had finally caught up with him, that he couldn't work the water anymore, that he needed to find something else to do with his life. Ruth was concerned watermen didn't just quit, not brooms, not men whose blood ran salt and whose families had worked these waters for 3 centuries. But Cecile was adamant, and eventually she stopped asking questions she could see he would never answer. He sold the Ruth Ann to a cousin for less than it was worth, took a job at the hardware store in Crisfield that required a ferry ride twice a day, and never set foot on the Chesapeake again. For 40 years, he kept the secret. He raised his sons, walked them to school, taught them to throw a baseball in the backyard instead of teaching them to run a potline. He watched them grow into men who worked on the mainland, who never showed interest in the water, who never knew their father had given up a legacy 3 centuries old because of something he saw in the fog one September morning. He walked his daughter-in-law down the aisle when his oldest boy got married, danced at the reception, smiled for photographs with arms that had once been gripped by something from the deep. He held his grandchildren, bounced them on his knee, told them stories about the island when he was young, but never the one story that mattered, never the truth about why their grandfather couldn't stand the sight of a crab pot or the smell of low tide. He went to church every Sunday, sang the hymns, listened to sermons about God's creation and his infinite wisdom, and said nothing about the creature in the water that suggested creation was larger and stranger and more terrible than any preacher knew. Ruth noticed things over the years she was his wife. She knew him better than anyone. She could read his silences and see the shadows behind his eyes. She noticed that Cecile never ate crab again, would leave the room if someone brought blue crabs to a gathering, would change the channel if a documentary about the Chesapeake came on television. She noticed that he refused to go near the water, even for family picnics on the beach, that he would make excuses to stay in the car while the grandchildren splashed in the shallows. She noticed that sometimes, late at night, he would wake with a sound that was almost a scream and lie rigid beside her, staring at the ceiling, his hands clenched at his sides, his breathing sharp and shallow. She asked once, years into their marriage, what he dreamed about. He told her he didn't remember. It was the only lie he ever told her, and he told it for 40 years. Cecile Broom died in March of 2019, peacefully in his sleep, at the age of 74. Ruth found him in the morning, his face calm, his hands relaxed at his sides, whatever dreams had troubled him for 4 decades finally over. She wept for the man she had loved since they were teenagers, the quiet man who had given up everything familiar and never explained why, who had carried something in his eyes that she had always known was too heavy to share. 3 weeks after the funeral, going through his things, she found the journal. It was in the bottom drawer of his desk, buried under decades of accumulated paper, its pages yellowed with age, but the handwriting still legible, still unmistakably Cecile's careful script. Ruth sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Cecile had written those words 40 years earlier, the same table where he had sat in silence the morning he came home and never went back to the water, and she read the truth about why her husband had quit crabbing. She read for 2 hours, moving slowly through the dense handwriting, going back and rereading passages when the words seemed too strange to be real. She read about the fog and the silence and the shape that circled his boat. She read about the hand that closed around his wrist, the face that rose from the water, the black eyes that studied him with alien intelligence. She read his final line, about wanting to know what the creature was, about the terrible kinship of curiosity that had passed between them in that moment, and she understood for the first time why her husband had carried such weight, why he had never been able to explain the change that came over him that September morning. Ruth Broom did not know what to do with what she had found. She was 81 years old, a widow of 3 weeks, a woman who had lived her whole life on an island where people did not discuss certain things, where the water kept its secrets and the families who worked it kept theirs. She could have burned the journal, could have protected her husband's memory, could have let the secret die with her the way Cecil had let it die with him. Instead, she gave it to her grandson Thomas, who worked at a television station in Norfolk, and told him to do whatever he thought was right. The journal was examined by document specialists, who authenticated the handwriting against other samples from Cecile Broom and confirmed that the paper and ink were consistent with 1979. Marine biologists who reviewed the account noted details that Cecil could not reasonably have known. He described the creature's teeth as angled backward in multiple rows, a feature common in deep-sea predators, but completely unknown in Chesapeake species. He described clicking vocalizations in complex patterns, consistent with echolocation and communication systems, only documented decades later. Researchers who compiled the account found that Cecil's description, the pale skin, the dark hair, the black eyes without iris or pupil, the elongated body ending in a scaled tail matched a handful of other reports from the Chesapeake region, accounts that had never been published, stories told in confidence and dismissed as impossible by everyone who heard them. The document specialists noted one other detail that gave weight to Cecil's account: the wrist of his right hand, visible in photographs taken at his wedding in 1973, showed no scarring, while photographs from 1981 and later showed a faint ring of discoloration around the corne, joint that his family had always assumed was from years of working crab pots. It wasn't. The Chesapeake Bay is shallow 30 feet on average, 170 at its deepest point, but it is vast, 200 miles long and 30 miles wide at its broadest, with countless tributaries and channels and underwater formations that have never been fully mapped. Its waters are murky, visibility measured in inches rather than feet, its depths hidden from any observation that doesn't involve actually entering them. Watermen on Tangier Island, when pressed after the journal became public, admitted that there had always been stories, things seen in the fog that no one talked about, catches that came up wrong, boats that went out and never came back with no explanation that satisfied the families left behind. The old-timers called them bay ghosts or water women or nothing at all, just shaking their heads and changing the subject when the conversation got too close to something they didn't want to name. One waterman, speaking on condition that his name not be used, said his grandfather had seen something in the fog in the 1940s and had never discussed it except to say that some things lived in the bay that had been there before the Brooms, before the colonists, before the people who came before them, and would be there long after everyone alive had turned to dust. Cecile Broom was not the first to see something in the fog off Tangier Island. His account was simply the first to be written down and preserved, the first to survive the silence that had swallowed all the others. The journal remains with his family, who have allowed portions to be shared with researchers, but have kept the final pages private, including Cecile's closing thoughts about the creature's apparent curiosity, about his sense that it had not meant him harm, about the question that haunted him for 40 years. What had it wanted to know? Ruth Broom died in 2022, 3 years after her husband, and was buried beside him in the Methodist Cemetery on Tangier Island, within sight of the water where Cecil had seen something that ended his life's work and began a silence that lasted until death. The old sunken barge still sits in 15 feet of water off the island's eastern shore. Local watermen run pot lines around it still, though some have noticed that the crabs there aren't what they used to be, that something about that patch of water feels different in a way they can't quite describe. The fog still rises on September mornings, thick and gray and absolute, erasing the world and leaving nothing but water and silence. And sometimes, the watermen say, when the conditions are just right, when the air is still and the water is calm and the fog presses in from all directions, you can feel something out there watching, something patient, something curious, something that has been in the bay longer than the brooms and will be there long after the last waterman pulls his final pot. Cecile Broom knew the answer to a question most people never think to ask. He carried it for 40 years, locked in a journal at the bottom of a drawer, a truth so heavy it bent his whole life around its weight. He never went back to the water, never touched another crab pot, never spoke the words that might have released him from his silence. Maybe he was protecting himself. Maybe he was protecting his family from a knowledge they couldn't carry. Or maybe, in some part of himself, he never examined too closely, he was protecting the creature, the thing with the woman's face and the black eyes and the mind that had studied him with such terrible, patient curiosity. "I don't think she meant me harm," he wrote. "I think she wanted to know what I was." Whatever answers Cecile Broom found that foggy morning in September 1979, he took them with him to his grave. But the creature is still out there, somewhere in the gray water of the Chesapeake, still watching, still curious, still waiting for the next hand to reach into the water. And when that hand comes, because it always does, because watermen will always work the bay, because some questions are too important not to ask, something will reach back. If you've seen something you can't explain, if you've encountered something in the fog or the deep water that doesn't match anything in the books, we want to hear your story. Leave it in the comments below and subscribe to Maritime Incident Files for more accounts from the deep.